Hey everybody, it's Albert, and in this video I'm going to be responding to the remaining spate of videos that Edward recently released that either directly addressed something I had said or written, or was addressing something in a comment somebody made in a video of mine, or some such thing. It was just all, Edward just went off on this whole tangent, whatever, of rapid fire videos, and they just seem to get stranger as each one was released, and you'll see what I'm talking about in a few minutes. But first, the first one I want to address is a video titled Fundamentalism versus Elaborism, and this seems to be more responding to the blog article I had written, and I had mentioned that in the first video I had done, that basically it was dealing with the historic church. Now and anyone can check that blog post, it's still there. It never, in any way, shape, or form, ever mentioned King James onlyism, ever mentioned the King James Bible. It has absolutely nothing to do with the topic. Okay? But somehow, it gets turned into that. And also remember that up to that point, I had not addressed King James onlyism in close to a year. It was not a topic that I considered really worth addressing at that point, and would have been perfectly happy to just let things be as they were. But, of course, King James onlyists, being the sort of attention-seeking types they are, just can't let that happen. So Edward felt a need to drag me back into this. So we'll just go through I'm not going to go through the whole video, because I'm just going to kind of go through bits and pieces of each, and I'll put links in the description box. You can watch them at your own pleasure or displeasure, probably more the case. In case you're wondering, by the way, the title of this video, Edwardpf123 Hears a Who. It was sort of like a little joke, but frankly, it's as good a theory as any as to where Edward gets his information, because it certainly has nothing to do with, let's say, history or reality. But we'll get to that as we move on. So let's just start with what Edward has to say.
Good afternoon. Today I did a video on Laban 312's attack on the King James Bible.
Edward's evidence for me attacking the King James Bible, if you watch that video he's referring to, that he made earlier, basically references a blog post of mine, Modernity, Postmodernity, and Catholicity, and it never mentions the King James Bible. It never mentions King James onlyism. It has nothing to do with that whatsoever. But somehow he reads it there and just reads it into it, and somehow that article becomes an attack on the King James Bible. Now, I suppose I could have sat there reading stuff from Shakespeare. He would have perceived that as an attack on the King James Bible, because why am I reading something in somewhat archaic English without it being the King James Bible? So that would have been, I guess in his mind, been an implicit attack on the King James Bible. Who knows? Edward is kind of in his own little world at this point, but so we just gotta kind of, go tread lightly here, okay? But let's just keep watching.
And his claiming that the historic faith is found in three traditions: the Catholic Church, Orthodoxy, and Anglican Church. And I got some replies on that YouTube, and one individual was claiming that fundamentalism derives some of its truth from these historical traditions. And I wanted to show you quickly here. This is a work called Fundamentals, 2-volume work. This was put out in the 1900s. And in this chapter here, chapter 21, you have a chapter here, is Romanism Christianity? And
there's so much confusion in what he just said that I'll try to piece through it. First of all, what I had actually was pointing out in that article is that there were three churches, Orthodoxy, Rome, and Catholicism and Anglicanism that could trace its lineage back to the historic church. That basically these churches grew out of the historic church, which is quite obvious. Other churches did not have a continual lineage, prior to the Reformation. Certainly, but the Anglican Church, the bishops of the first bishops after the split with Rome were the same bishops who were there before the split with Rome, with a few exceptions. So they actually continued that lineage, and certainly they made changes in terms of their beliefs in keeping with certain principles they held, that they considered returning to earlier traditions. And certainly all of these traditions went through a period of development, and you may say that development was bad, good, or indifferent, but the fact is they all can trace themselves back to the historic church. And that was the point I was making, that they actually have links that they can return to. And that, so if you go back far enough, you find theologians of interest in the early church, that a lot of evangelicals are now investigating these histories. And Edward just completely missed the point of the whole article just by, it's obvious, because I was not speaking of their current state, I was speaking of their past history. But somehow he's making it sound as though I'm saying that those three are the only three that can be legitimate or something, and that wasn't the point of the article, and anyone who read it would know that. But this is Edward, so I mean, he's kind of, like I said, but look, if he can read the King James Bible into that video, then I get in that blog post rather, I guess he can read pretty much anything into it, so it shouldn't be a surprise. Now, his response also, someone mentioned that a lot of things in fundamentalism were basically left over from those traditions, and Edward's evidence, of course, is to point out this collection of books, the Fundamentals, which, of course, since at this point, it's just so bizarre, you don't even know what to say. Everyone's aware that fundamentalism doesn't like Roman Catholicism, but that doesn't mean they haven't retained a lot of beliefs that developed into these historic traditions. They may not like that fact. They may not like the idea that they basically, because when you think about it, when you talk about reforms being made, reform what, Edward? What are you reforming? You're reforming something that's already in existence. And different, more modern traditions may have reformed it in different ways and peeled away different parts, but a lot of the same beliefs, a lot of beliefs that Edward has are affirmed in these historic traditions, like, the belief in the Trinity, I'm assuming he does at this point, belief in the deity of Christ, etc. These things were part of those earlier churches also. It's not that they denied these things. Now, certainly each of those churches added their own things over the centuries, and you may argue about those things and whether they are legitimate developments or whether they were mistakes. But there is this core belief that all these churches hold, Edward. But Edward seems to think that if someone says they got them from those early traditions, that means that those earlier traditions weren't biblically based, which is not the case. A tradition is not necessarily something in opposition or in addition to Scripture. All tradition is something that's handed down. So from that standpoint, even the biblical beliefs are considered tradition because they are handed down from generation to generation. You simply, the theology developed from the biblical text is passed on, but Edward misses all of this entirely. One more thing I'm going to point out, and I'm not going to subject you to any more of this particular video. You can watch it at your own pleasure or whatever. But if you're going to search for the historic Christian faith, you don't look into the fundamentals. That's a modernist development. And yes, it is conservative Christian, but it is also modernist. It is not an historically rooted work. These books were basically reactions They were conservative reactions to modernist developments, but the whole conversation takes place within a modernist framework, within an interpretation of Scripture that is basically Anglo-American, late 19th, early 20th century. Its approach to Scripture was very much in keeping with modernist principles. It, in fact, is nothing but a reaction to earlier modernist developments, but still answering these developments from a modernist viewpoint. And so you get, for example, the whole fundamentalist movement begins as in a dispute in the late 19th, early 20th centuries at Princeton Theological Seminary and the Presbyterian Church, and then spreads to other Protestant groups in the United States and to a lesser extent in England. That was in reaction to other developments taking place, particularly in Europe, in terms of higher criticism. And that's what and as well as other social influences such as Darwinism, etc. That's what the fundamentals was about. That's how the fundamentalist movement started. While it is conservative and it is Christian, it certainly upholds certain key elements of the historic faith, it doesn't see them from an historic viewpoint. It really tries to make its case using modernist assumptions, in terms of the way it approaches the text. It reads it in a very modernist. It basically the kind of what you would expect from someone living in early 20th century America to approach the text, rather than seeing them in. It doesn't take anything in its historical context or anything like that. It just approaches it in a certain way. So this is not where you're going to find the historic Christian faith, and that doesn't mean there weren't good things in it. But this is not anything but a conservative Christian form of modernism. Okay, now we're going to move to another video he makes the day after, titled "The Apostasy of the Professing Churches and the Real Church." Now, what I think is important here is to understand the sequence of events. On February, he had made his initial videos over a couple of days. I had made my response on February 9th. He had actually made comments on that response. And now on February 10th, he is making another video. Now, so this is after my first response is already out there, where I pointed out I have not discussed King James onlyism in a year, and that blog post has nothing to do with the topic. You can't find it in there. And I challenge Edward, put up or shut up. Let's, and basically said, are you some sort of lie? Are you a liar, Edward? Or are you bearing false witness? And hoping that it would just, jar something, realize, oops. And then at this point, I'm thinking maybe he didn't understand that I hadn't talked about the subject in a year, because I really had no interaction with him. Maybe he wasn't keeping track of anything I was doing, and he assumed I was still making King James onlyist videos, so I was trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. Well, now he does know this, and here's his next video.
Good morning. Recently I did a video discussing Labium 312 and why he is attacking the King James Bible.
So let's get this right. He knows I've never attacked the King James Bible. He knows I've only attacked King James onlyism, and I haven't even done that in a year. And the article that he was reading has nothing to do with either topic, but he begins this video off by stating I was talking about Labium 312 and why he's attacking the King James Bible. So at this point he knows he's wrong. He knows it. It's been pointed out to him. But he still is willfully at this point. It's not a mistake. It's not an error. This time it's willful dishonesty. He's a liar. He's just a flat-out liar. There's no other way of putting it. He's a liar. And that's... And once you understand that, okay, Edward's a liar, let's move on.
And his view of the historical faith, and that is linked with the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox and the Anglican Church in his case, as he said. And he was saying that, well, I was accusing him of being involved in some conspiracy. He thinks everyone is dealing with conspiracies, and that's his big bugbear, and especially the King James only people. But in fact, we're not dealing with conspiracy; we're dealing with prophecy. In Matthew 13:33, the commentary here, Buckman writes here.
You gotta love this. You gotta love this. First of all, he again he points to the three traditions, and he doesn't really understand what I was talking about, but that's kind of par for the course at this point. But then he says, well, he's just accusing us of being conspiracy theorists, and that's that's not true. It's not conspiracy theories, it's prophecy, etc., etc. So he then starts making his case for it not being a conspiracy theory, and he doesn't really. You had to listen carefully, and I had to stop and go back and listen to it again. So, did he just say that? Yes, he did. He's reading a commentary on the passage, and it turns out that if you listen, as in that commentary, he says, and then Ruckman says. So basically, the commentary he's reading is by Peter Ruckman, a conspiracy theorist, and you don't have to take my word for it. Just Google Peter Ruckman, and they'll include pages of his fans and his not so fans, and I'll just let you make your judgment for yourself, including his theories about UFOs, his theories about all sorts of things. And I've got a couple of books by Peter Ruckman. I've got his church history, which is one of the most delusional pieces of literature ever written in the history of mankind. I also have his manuscript evidence, which is basically he doesn't know what he's talking about, or he's at this with Ruckman. I think he kind of knows, but he just doesn't care about that. He's one of like most King James onlyists. The truth doesn't really matter. At least in his wing of it, the Ruckman Ripplinger end. There may be, other people who are less delusional, who are maybe more hopeful, but these people are just angry conspiracy theorists and clinging to just all sorts of strange ideas. And the fact that you're going to start out making the case that you're not a conspiracy theorist by quoting a commentary by a conspiracy theorist pretty much says all that needs to be said about this video, so I'll just stop it here and go to the next one. Next, we have Edward making a video titled The Translators of the King James Bible Support King James Onlyism, which is the single most ridiculous title of any video Edward has ever made. Now, I realize I think some time ago he made a video on the topic, so I kind of knew what his argument was going to be. I didn't address it at that point, mainly because I wasn't talking about King James onlyism anymore, and I just figured anybody can read the preface. And I challenge people, please, do not take my word for it. Certainly don't take Edward's word for it, since, we've already seen he's not really that truthful. But go read the preface. I'm willing to state, go read it in its entirety. In its entirety. Not quote mined, as Edward is going to do here, and ignore actually the context, but read it in its entirety. Read the part where it states that there's words in there, Hebrew words, that the meaning has been lost over this. Nobody really knew, and they basically had to make a guess at it using context. And they admitted their work is not perfect. They also say something else, and we'll get to that. But please do not take my word for it. And I'm not even going to point. I'll say Google King James Version preface and look at a number of sites just to make sure. I don't want you to think that I'm pointing you to a site that doesn't have the real preface in it or something. I want you to go check it yourself and read it. In fact, I've had a number of people who've taken that challenge and are no longer in King James onlyism. They left it once they realized what the King James translators actually thought. They realized that this position is simply not defensible. But please do not take my word for it. Go and check for yourself. But let's take a look at what Edward's got to say.
Good afternoon. One of the attacks against those who believe the King James Bible is the perfect word of God is the view that the translator somehow says something different than we believe in. And in fact, that's not true.
Actually, Edward, it is true, but we're just going to let you hang yourself with your own rope, so let's just keep listening.
In the preface to the work of the King James Bible, King James translators make it very clear that the purpose of creating that translation was to make a good one better, or out of many good ones, one principal good one, which principle means primary, not justly to be accepted against. In other words, they were making a final authority.
No, Edward, that's not what it means. And here Edward gets into all sorts of trouble. He's rather in over his head at this point because he knows nothing about church history and certainly nothing about the history of events that were leading up to the production of the King James Bible and the goings-on in the church in the British Isles at that point. King James had been King of Scotland, and he then inherited the throne of England, and he was attempting to unite his realm under basically one religion, although he certainly was going to allow them to keep their basic ecclesial structures. The Scottish Church was Presbyterian, the English Church was Anglican, but he wanted to try to unite them, at least in some sense. He had issued a new Book of Common Prayer in 1604, and now he was trying to come up with a single Bible, because there was lots of problems in terms of disputes with the Bibles being in use at the time. The Geneva Bible, which was probably the most popular, had various interpretations that were definitely anti-ecclesial and particularly anti-monarchist, which obviously the King James was not going to be a big fan of. And James had also had some issues when he was King of Scotland, where basically the Scottish Church kind of ruled the king rather than the other way around. So he was much more comfortable with the English structure in which the king ruled the church in that realm, and had more say in things, because the Scottish Church felt they could in fact delegitimize a king, and certainly Edward didn't think. Though Edward was very much a supporter of the divine right of kings. Now, it turns out that he wanted to get this new translation, and that there was opposition to any new translation, particularly when the committee ended up being pretty much loaded down with High Church Anglicans. You can understand, there, certainly among English Puritans as well as Scottish Presbyterians, there were going to be some trembling or whatever, or concerns with such a development. And what they're doing here is trying to say that, look, we're taking these other Bibles, and out of many versions make a better one. They didn't say a perfect one; they said a better one. And also to make out of them one primary Bible and what they're talking about here is a primary Bible for use in the British Isles. That this was going to be the Bible for James's realm. And that's what the whole conversation is about. And they're dealing with the whole political issue at this point, and the opposition they were meeting, and not talking about this being the perfect Bible or anything like that. And in fact, what Edward says when he's talking about, when they say not being accepted against, accepted against means basically opposed. They're making a Bible that will not be opposed. And what they're speaking of here are other parties that may oppose this new translation. It has nothing to do with it being a final authority, Edward, but your ignorance of church history, in particular the history in that period in the church in the British Isles, makes you come to these bizarre conclusions. Your belief system did not exist until within the last century. It just was never a part of their concerns at all. So this is just so bizarre. And I'd say again, I'd recommend Nicholson's God's Secretaries, which is basically a very readable but still scholarly treatment of the development of the King James Bible by someone who really likes the King James Bible. So this is not in any way, that book is not in any way an attack on the King James Bible, but it's very honest about what happened and how this came to be. But the person who wrote it is very much a huge supporter of the King James Bible. So I would suggest, Edward, you read that book, and you'll have a better understanding of the history of that period, and maybe you won't make such ridiculous statements as you just did.
Not to be argued against. They also point out that they said neither do we think much to consult the translators or commentators, Chaldee, Hebrew, Syrian, Greek, or Latin, no, not the French, Spanish, French, Italian, or Dutch. Neither did we disdain to revise that which we had done, and to bring back to the amble that which we had handled, but having and using it as great helps as were needful, and fearing no reproach for slowness, nor coveting praise for expedition, we have at the length enough good through the good hand of the Lord upon us. So they believe the Lord was involved in the translation. It was not just a translation done by secular scholars. It was done by men who believed that the Holy Spirit was involved in this translation.
Edward, you get more ridiculous as you move along, because when they speak of God's hand being upon them, this is a common term at the time, and basically they're seeing what they're doing as a work of providence. That this is something that God is comforting them, that that they feel His hand upon them. That's not the same thing. But lots of people can feel God's hand upon them as they're doing something for the good of the kingdom. That doesn't necessarily mean all of these things are divinely inspired in the way that they would believe the original texts were when they were written. That's not the same thing, Edward, and you don't seem to understand that. And no, they did not think this was the final authority. Now, to the topic of whether the King James translators had a final authority. Yes, Edward, in the preface they mention their final authority, and they claim it is the same one that was used by earlier translators, particularly Jerome. Yes, St. Jerome, the translator of the Vulgate, is highly praised by the King James translators in the preface, as is Origen, another person who Edward's not a particularly big fan of, or any of those in the King James only camp, but the King James translators did not feel the same way. And in fact, they especially praised Jerome. But in speaking of Jerome's earlier translations of Jerome and those assisting him, and particularly, they also speak of when Jerome and his contemporary Augustine, another one that I don't imagine Edward's a big fan of. The King James translators state, if you ask what they had before them, truly it was the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, the Greek of the New. These are the two golden pipes, or rather conduits, wherethrough the olive branches empty themselves into gold. And then using this, they build upon it and state their own final authority, which they say, that is the credit of the old books. He meaneth of the Old Testament is to be tried by the Hebrew volumes, so of the new by the Greek tongue. He meaneth the original Greek. If truth be tried by these tongues, then whence should a translation be made but out of them? These tongues, therefore, the scriptures we say, in those tongues we set before us to translate, being the tongues wherein God was pleased to speak to His church by the prophets and apostles. So, Edward, the King James translators themselves state explicitly that the final authority is the Hebrew of the Old Testament and the Greek of the New. There's nothing else to say about this video, but Edward takes this one little sentence, clings to it, totally out of the historical context, and misses all this stuff all over the preface, which completely contradicts his entire belief system. But that's pretty much what you get with King James Onlyism now, isn't it? There are two other videos, and they're probably not really worth showing excerpts of, so I'm not going to bother. But I will put the links are down there. You can go watch them. I'll give a brief description of them. One was One was in response to a user named Barb Sinclair who made a comment on my initial response to Edward, in which she pointed out the preface, and Edward made this video basically saying she was wrong, and in the video he held up the King James Bible and held up a copy of the preface to the King James Bible and said, "You're wrong." That was it. No explanation, no facts, just, look, I've got these two books. You're wrong. That was the whole video. Go watch it. Just that's what I'm saying. You got strangers that went on. Then apparently he realized he actually hadn't said anything, and then went back and repeated what we just went over about the preface, which of course is entirely wrong. So that's pretty much it. Edwardpf123 Hears a Who. Thank you very much for your time.